Hi, everybody. Before we get to another great interview, the Two Opinionated podcast could really use your help. And it's easy, it's free. IMDb, which is the entertainment database, imdb.com, named us a top 100 podcast. We came in at number 82. That's a big deal because there's 15 million podcasts and growing. So to be named to anybody's top 100 list, pretty big deal for us. And the way you can help is to go to imdb.com, look up the Two Opinionated podcast, and that's it. Just bringing our page up. That traffic really helps us out. Our YouTube channel is MeisterCon Pod. All we ask is that you subscribe. It's also free, but that really helps us to attract these amazing guests that we keep bringing on the program. And that's it. Two easy ways for you to support us, and we would really appreciate the help. Now let's get to that interview. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Two Opinionated. I'm so excited today. I've got retired National Park Service Special Agent, Paul Berkowitz. So welcome, Paul.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to talk with you, Paul. And let's start this way. Talk a little bit. I know you're retired now, but talk a little bit about what it was that you did when you were working for the Park Service, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. I actually started with the Park Service when I was going through college, working as a seasonal. Yeah. So I did volunteer work and then semi-paid work for the Park Service at Grand Canyon. So I went to school at San Diego.
Yeah.
Would go back and forth to the Grand Canyon and work summers and holidays and stuff like that. And then when I turned 21, I was able to get a law enforcement job at Lake Mead, which is a pretty high activity area right outside of Las Vegas. Did that for quite a while, and then looking for permanent work, because again, that was seasonal status. I didn't have benefits and stuff.
Yeah.
And after
as
that,
a lot of us are when we first get out of college, you're just looking for that stability.
But so I applied around to different departments, and I got a job as a deputy with the Boulder County Sheriff's Department.
Yeah.
And worked for them for a while. But shortly after getting hired by them, I actually got an offer to be a criminal investigator with the National Park Service at a place called Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which is outside of Chicago and Gary, Indiana.
Yeah.
So moved there. They sent me to criminal.
What does that job entail? What are you investigating?
Well, basically, criminal investigations, the same as it would be, say, for a detective with a police department. And but working strictly on federal crime. Gotcha. Which is can be pretty expansive depending upon the specific jurisdiction that you're working in.
Yeah.
So at Indiana Dunes, it was primarily, assaults on officers, arson, dealing with the local population. It's a recreational area, so a lot of crazy activity going on. And from there, actually, you start moving around the country when you're working with the Park Service, which was one of the appealing things, the mobility and the ability to work in different places. So from Indiana Dunes, I actually got hired as a criminal investigator in Yosemite National Park.
Okay.
And Yosemite, pretty high profile place. And what I was actually hired primarily to do there was work on a drug task force. So, unknown to a lot of people, parks are like tourist towns, a lot of them.
Sure.
And they attract a certain element, both working for the concessions, the hotels and stuff, and then also people going to parks to kind of not only enjoy nature, but some people go there to get crazy and out of control.
Yeah.
So, we dealt there with, murderers and rapes and robberies and stuff like that. But my principal function was in drug enforcement, working with undercover operatives and buying drugs and stuff like that.
Yeah, I never would have thought that would be a needed job in a national park, but it completely makes sense. I understand why you might need that.
Yeah, and the general population is not aware of the law enforcement function that the National Park Service has, and that's kind of deliberate on the part of the agency, that they try to downplay that. It's like a Disneyland, right? They don't want you to think that they have a pretty intensive security force going on at Disneyland with all this stuff. But if you're having millions of people coming in, every day from outside. Not to mention, again, the locals who live there, the residential, the family disputes, the domestics. It's like any other community. But again, the Park Service historically has downplayed that role. They try to conceal it from the public, which is what a lot of my writing actually focuses on. It's trying to reinforce the law enforcement role that our rangers have in national parks.
Yeah.
So did that for quite a while. After Yosemite, I transferred up to a place called Whiskey Town in Northern California, where I was the chief of law enforcement there. And when I was at Whiskey Town, then after, again, a number of years, I got recruited to go back to Washington, D.C., where I was the assistant special agent in charge. And that involved working on a lot of policy issues for the Park Service. We rearmed the entire agency with modern weapons, and that was one of my functions, was to secure those.
What were they using predominantly before you rearmed them?
Well, like a lot of departments back in the 80s and early 90s, they were, using revolvers.
Yeah.
And just a mishmash of rifles. And it was time to transition into semi-automatics.
Yeah.
And so there, you have to.
Well, that's probably in response to the threats that you're facing, I'm assuming.
Well, not only that, but the fact that the revolvers were getting worn out. And if you're going to spend money on replacing them, why not go with something more efficient and more modern?
Yeah, for sure.
So we led a contract for a couple thousand pistols and 1,000 M16 rifles that we got from the military. So I worked on a lot of that. But in addition to that, I ended up doing a lot of internal investigations for the Department of Interior.
Yeah.
So those two things were the primary work that I did there. And from there, I don't know if you remember the downsizing of government under the Clinton administrations. It sounds familiar, right? But they moved a lot of positions out to the field, and I transferred to Grand Canyon National Park, where I became the chief of law enforcement there and the special agent in charge of small cadre of special agents that worked around the Southwest. So did that for a number of years.
You were all over the country.
Well, yeah, but again, that was one of the appealing things about working for the National Park Service.
Yeah.
Most of the areas were pretty spectacular, but like Indiana Dunes was not visually spectacular. It was pretty interesting, but not my idea of, beautiful scenery. And then finally, I ended up transferring out to the Navajo Indian Reservation, where I focused on Indian country crime through a cooperative agreement. And that was
how did that work? Because I know, normally on a Indian area, they'll have their own kind of law enforcement.
It depends. It's kind of complicated, but it depends on what state you're in.
Yeah.
There's a section they call 280, or if it's a 280 state, then like California is, then local authorities generally have the principal responsibility for law enforcement.
Okay.
In Arizona, New Mexico, it's not. So it gets very complicated where depends on the status of the victim and the offender.
Yeah.
So if it's native on native or Indian on Indian, it's tribal. If it's Indian on non-Indian or non-Indian on Indian, it's federal. If it's non-Indian on non-Indian, it's state. So really complicated. It makes for really interesting work.
Yeah. Well, and I'm assuming you'd all have to cooperate.
You all have to cooperate, but by and large, either through deputizations or cooperative agreements. And plus, when there's a crime, a lot of times if there's a victim, you don't know who the offender is, so you don't know who the parties are.
Right.
So,
but how does that work? If you don't know, does everybody investigate until you kind of come up with a suspect and then it narrows down?
Generally speaking, it would be, for the serious crimes, which is what we focused on.
Yeah.
And drug enforcement. There are federal crimes that apply throughout the country, no matter where you are, regardless of jurisdiction.
Sure.
Federal drug crimes, right? Federal firearms violations. Assaults on federal officers are always federal. So those are automatically federal. And the FBI, and again, I work closely with the FBI out there. They were generally investigated strictly as federal. And then if you found out that the parties were different, then you'd approach the state for prosecution. But again, you're probably the single most interesting time in my career were those last 3 years. And then I was assigned an interesting case that had been floundering for about 2 years at a place called Hubble Trading Post National Historic Site,
Yeah.
and that's one of the books that I've written, The Case of the Indian Trader,
Oh, right,
where
right.
the old-time Indian trader who worked there had been mistakenly accused of embezzlement of like $5 million. And it was a legitimate old-time Indian trader, just almost like on TV. They didn't keep books. The locals would come in. This is way out in the middle of nowhere on the
Yeah.
reservation.
So this trader, this old time trader, was supposed to have embezzled $5 million.
Yeah, what happened was that he actually worked for an outfit called Western National Parks Association.
Yeah.
It's a nonprofit. They work in a lot of parks. They sell, in the bookstores, you see their stands and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because of an interesting arrangement, he worked for them. They got new management. And when they came in, they didn't understand how he operated. He didn't have a computer. A local, an old grandma would come in with a rug and he'd give her a bunch of food and write on a napkin, okay, if you come in 6 months and, bring me another rug. It was a barter system.
Yeah.
And it was totally baffling to the new management. They didn't understand it when they looked at their books, and their own finances had been mismanaged. So when they saw a $5 million deficit, they blamed him because they didn't understand how it worked.
Right.
And so they launched a huge investigation for about a year and a half, 2 years. They couldn't figure out what was going on. They couldn't come up with any violations. And because I was already out there and I had pretty close ties with the Navajo community, they approached me and asked me to take over the investigation. So a year and a half in. And within about the first month of it, I found that the allegations were false. That, he hadn't done a bunch of the stuff that they alleged because they simply hadn't done the digging or hadn't asked the right questions.
Yeah, he was just doing what he had always done, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and he was doing exactly what he'd been hired to do.
Yeah.
Because he had been hired, the mandate for that place was to keep it running as an old-time, Old West trading post.
Yeah.
And he was one of the last of the breed out there. He spoke Navajo. His family was Navajo. I mean, he was just immersed in Navajo culture and the barter system. And basically, if you need it, I'll give it to you. We'll make it up later.
Right.
And that just didn't wash with their system of accounting.
Were you able to figure out what was actually happening?
Yeah. And it turned out from just misunderstanding. And then it turned into a little bit of corrupting. So this guy, he didn't have a bank account, mind you.
Yeah.
But what he had was a lifelong collection of rugs and jewelry. And when they saw that he had all this stuff, they assumed, well, he must have stolen it because nobody could have that much stuff. But that was his bank account.
Right.
So,
well, and if you know how that goes, you accumulate a lot of stuff just going through life. But if that was actually your currency, of course it's going to get piled up.
Yeah, not only that, but his wife was a jeweler and a weaver, and his family did all that. So, I mean, there was tons of stuff in his home. And in the early stages of the investigation, they got a search warrant, raided his house, saw all this stuff, and seized it all. And when they seized it all, the impression that his employer had, Western National Parks, was that, oh, we'll get this all back. And so it turned into kind of a more just a confusion into a kind of a little bit of a greedy thing, because they thought they were going to get his collection of, worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in old rugs and jewelry. I mean, some of the stuff was really, really old and valuable.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, basically digging into the case and starting to actually ask questions and talking to the local Navajos and, and the other people in the trading community, it turned out that, no, he was just doing business the old-fashioned way. It didn't click with the modern, system of accounting, which, and again, their own system of accounting was pretty messed up. And that's what ultimately was revealed. So I cleared him and ended up turning my investigation over to the Office of the Inspector General because of some of the misconduct on the part of Western National Parks and the Park Service itself. And so he was exonerated, and they launched an investigation into his employers.
Well, did he
And
get his stuff back?
I gave him his stuff back, which really pissed off a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, but it's his stuff.
It was his stuff, but they, again, they were kind of in the mind, no, we were going to get this. So anyway, yeah, he got it all back. They weren't particularly grateful to me for having done that, but I did it with the approval of the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Right.
And after I turned in my report and finished up the case, I turned in my retirement papers. So
what was that? Were those two connected?
you mean retirement and
yeah. Did you retire because of the case, or was that just coincidental?
It was partly because of the case, and also I had been involved in a couple of whistleblowing efforts in my career.
Right.
And the last whistleblowing thing that I had, when I turned in my this final case on the Indian trader, it implicated the deputy director of the Park Service, his wife,
yeah,
my immediate supervisor. Basically, when I took over the case, after, again, it had been going on for a year and a half, they'd spent nearly $1 million on it with no results. And when they asked me to take over the case, they basically said, just find something to charge this guy with. We don't care what it is, just so we can justify the past work.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And I wasn't about to do that. I reported that immediately to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and just to make sure that they knew what was going on. So yeah, a series of events like that put me kind of out of favor with management, and I just didn't need any more of it. So
yeah, I think I'd have walked away from that too. But it did give you a really interesting story to write about.
Well, and it gave me the freedom to talk.
That's right.
And so yeah, when I retired, the first thing I did was set about writing a book about that, to kind of tell the story. And and there's no money in writing books, but it was about more like getting the word out, clearing this guy's name, and also just talking about how the agency functions, the fact that there is a huge law enforcement component to the Park Service with the Rangers and their special agents, but that sometimes things go haywire, and there needs to be mechanisms there to bring it back in line.
That's right. That's exactly right. So kind of fast forward to today, and we're the Park Service undergoing a lot of changes. What just from your perspective, what has that been like? Has that been a positive change, a negative change? Is it is it much ado about nothing? What kind of is your take on the cutbacks that we're seeing?
Well, in all three books that I've written, I've tried to emphasize the fact, again, that historically law enforcement is a principal function of certain park rangers.
That's right.
And that there's always been criminal investigations going on in the National Park Service in the field. When I was in Washington, D.C., one of the things that we did was we created a legitimate organized criminal investigations branch. And at that time, in the early to mid 90s, we had 60 agents nationwide, which is still not a lot.
No, that doesn't, I mean, that's, barely one a state, basically.
Yeah. And at that time, there were roughly 2,500 to maybe 3,000 commissioned law enforcement rangers. So, not when the public sees a ranger, they don't know what their function is. They all wear the same uniform. But about 2,500 of them were commissioned with law enforcement authority and training and everything. And by probably, the early 2000s, 2010, those numbers had dropped by half.
Oh,
so there are now only about 30 special agents nationwide. That's half, and about half the number of commissioned law enforcement rangers.
Yeah, that's a big reduction.
Yeah, and a lot of that was just because of incremental budget cuts to the Park Service. And this is before all the DOGE stuff. And the cuts that have resulted from the DOGE effort have made it even worse. So the Park Service was already hurting for law enforcement personnel and personnel generally. And recent, stuff that's happened under this administration has made it even worse. And on top of that, of course, remember that visitation in national parks has increased millions. I mean,
Yeah.
so you've got a reduced size workforce trying to deal with increasing workload. And it's kind of tragic. And you know, it's more dangerous for the public, and it's more dangerous for the law enforcement personnel and other emergency services personnel who are working.
Well, so it as just from the public's viewpoint, what will we notice? Because
Well,
most
the
of the
first,
time the park rangers are more in the background, but they're there if you need them. But what will we notice from kind of the cuts?
well, first of all, probably delayed response times to
Yeah.
emergencies. Um, Probably the fact that, you know, if you have, let's say there's a fight in progress
Yeah.
and you have three rangers to respond to that fight, you can use, you know, you can get it over with, you can deal with it more quickly. You can probably use lesser levels of force because there's more of you. You don't have to, you know, it's not such a hazard to the rangers, so you can use, you know, reduced techniques. And so if number one, if it's a delayed response time, the violence or the crime is going on for a longer period of time. And then when the ranger gets there, it's more dangerous for the ranger, and maybe things have to escalate
Right.
because you don't have the resources to properly deal with it, which is, you know, has long been a function, you know, of land management law enforcement, the Park
Sure.
Service, but also the Forest Service. So those guys are out in the middle of nowhere and without backup a lot of times. And it makes it more dangerous than a lot of times in an urban environment where, you know, you swarm the place with law enforcement to deal with a situation that keeps it from escalating.
I mean,
So,
that
you know,
that all makes perfect sense to me, and I'm not the smartest person out there. You know, why do you think cuts were made? I mean, that to me, you should be able to look at that and say, yeah, we kind of need the people that we have on staff. Why would you cut that?
part of it is the way the Park Service has been organized.
Yeah,
So even though every national park is part of the agency, the National Park Service, you know, and national monuments and recreation areas are all included in that.
sure.
The way that each park is managed is largely dependent upon the attitude and the priorities of the superintendent who runs that area. So, for example, Yellowstone right now is a great example where they've got a superintendent who has a strong law enforcement background, is very much an advocate for law enforcement and emergency services.
Right.
So up until recent times, because of cuts, he's had a very, very capable law enforcement capability. They've got a full-blown tactical team that can respond to incidents that, you know, they had an armed incident with a guy with a, you know, an M16 type rifle, you know, an active shooter situation
Yeah.
going on in the dorms. Their tactical team was able to go in there and take them out because they had that capacity, because that superintendent supported the training and supported the funding for the staffing. If that superintendent were to leave and you got another superintendent in there with different priorities, that could all evaporate.
Right.
And that can happen across the country. So the inconsistency from one park administration to the next from time to time has a dramatic effect on how operations are run and funded. But that also applies, by the way, to different programs. So if you
Right.
get a superintendent who's pro interpretation, they'll build that program up and let others fall to the wayside. So there's a lack of consistency that is a problem for the agency.
What do you think would be a solution to that? Is that just a matter of hiring more people, or is it bigger than that?
Well, it's number one, hiring more people so that you're not dealing with, you know, limited resources that have to be allocated very, very conservatively.
Right.
So it's like, you know, well, we don't have enough people to clean the bathroom, so we'll put it there, but that means we have to take away funding from some other place.
Sure.
Making choices that you really shouldn't have to make, and they're at a critical level, and they have been at a critical level for a long time.
Yeah.
The other thing is that from the Washington office, there needs to be greater oversight. And there are actually policies in place that have been in place for years that say, you know, no net loss of emergency services. That was a policy back in the 90s
Right.
based on staffing and funding. Well, that went by the wayside a long time ago, even though it was in policy. So a lot of it is Washington saying, no, here's the policy, we're going to enforce the policy. And frankly, having people there who are in a position to advocate for funding. Because, it does all come down to funding.
Right.
And, it's pretty terrible. They're saying, that, I mean, they don't even have enough money now to keep visitor centers open 7 days a week.
Well, and that's kind of my thought process is, why would you, as an administration, cut funding to your national parks? I mean, don't you have to have staff for those? You can't just let people just roam through the parks.
But you can. I mean, yeah, the damage to the resources,
Right.
the visitors, all of that is a problem. But now you're getting into kind of political territory, right?
Sure.
With congressional funding. What are the priorities of, coming on down through the secretary's office to the director of the agency's office, and how those funds are allocated. But I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, the Rangers in particular, the law enforcement folks, do not have, they don't have a union, they don't have collective bargaining.
Right.
They don't really even have an organization that's there to speak up for them, to say, we are hurting, we need funding, and the consequences of not having funding are this for the public and for us. So most people don't really understand the magnitude of the problem. One of the things that I've tried to do, again, in my writing, some of the op-eds that I've done and in conversations with you, is to share with the public and to make them more aware and make Congress more aware of the critical role that Park Service staff plays in keeping these places safe and keeping them, protecting the resources, protecting the public. Because people just generally, when they think of Rangers, they don't get it. They don't understand the many functions that the different kinds of Rangers play. The public doesn't understand the difference between a uniformed maintenance man, a uniformed person working the visitor center desk, and a uniformed ranger out there in a patrol car, fully armed. They don't get that there's a difference in what these guys and gals do.
Well, and is that partly on the park system for not doing a better job promoting that, or was that by design?
Well, historically, yeah, I think that is in the Park Service. They have what they call the Ranger image. Yeah. And that's like the subtitle of the one book, the legacy of the Yosemite Mafia, the Ranger image and noble cause corruption in the Park Service. That for years they've tried to promote the Ranger image, which has meant warm, friendly, inviting, hi, howdy. There's no crime in parks. You don't have to worry about it. Therefore,
right. You think of the kind of the unarmed ranger walking through and saying, hey, make sure that you put that fire out when you get ready to leave.
Yeah. Don't litter, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that's well and good and an essential component, but you don't think of them as full-blown professional law enforcement officers, of which a significant, although diminishing number of personnel have as their fundamental duty. And that is something where the Park Service has failed itself and has failed its employees by failing to recognize and promote that critical role and function. And remember too, that these same officers are the first ones responding to a medical or, a traffic accident, for other emergency services, for search and rescue, just like a sheriff's department would, right? Yeah. So they're performing multiple functions for emergency services. And when you diminish their numbers, you diminish their capacity to provide those services. Another thing that is critical, that is not, I think, not recognized in these recent cuts, and we're talking over the last 6 months or so, is that other personnel, let's say maintenance, you cut maintenance staff, who's there to work on the patrol cars?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Who's there to work on the communication systems if you don't have the technicians in the maintenance division to uphold those systems? And the other interesting thing about the national parks generally, especially the bigger, more historical parks, is that because of their isolated nature, national parks, by their very nature, have often developed some of the more efficient, if you will, methods of operation, given the low staffing levels and the isolated nature of where they are.
Right.
So in a big emergency situation, you have a lot of people in other divisions, let's say in interpretation or maintenance, who have been trained as EMTs. So in a big event, it's not just the law enforcement personnel. You can call upon maintenance or interpretation to go man the ambulance, to
Right.
provide those services. You have a large number of those people in other divisions that are what they call red carded. So if there's a fire, those people leave their interpretive or their maintenance assignment and go help fight the fire. So by cutting those positions, you diminish the capacity of the entire operation there to provide essential emergency services. And that's
And it would
something.
seem to me too that if you're making all these cuts, you're also, when you do need to hire somebody, it's going to make it more difficult to find a qualified candidate.
Well, not only that, but given, for example, there were originally all these cuts that were handed down with these letters saying that you're not meeting standards, these generic letters to people they didn't even know and didn't have a clue about.
Right.
And then all the cuts, and then saying, okay, well, you can rehire law enforcement personnel. Well, in the meanwhile, a lot of those people have gotten other jobs. And in the meanwhile, they're also looking and going, well, how secure is this job? If they did it once, they can do it again.
Right.
So right now,
why would you come back to that if you're thinking it's just going to be temporary anyway?
Yeah, you don't know how secure it is. And remember that you're having to move across the country for this job, moving your family.
Right.
And you just can't take that chance. So it's had a negative impact in terms of recruitment and retention, where you just create an environment of uncertainty and low morale, and people just say, I just don't need this, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
So there's been the unintended consequence, or maybe it was intended, of disillusioning people so that they won't want to work there.
Well, right. That's kind of the thought I was having is you're at some point, if we decide that we want to correct this, you're just making it that much more difficult.
Well, and that has happened, right? They initially froze all the hiring and fired probationary employees.
Yeah.
And then they said, well, no, we'll hire you back. You can come back. And it's like, I just moved my family across the country again, had to find a place to live. And you want me to come back now to an indefinite offer? So even if they were to restore all of the positions that they had previously, you're going to have, reduced numbers just because why would anybody want to take that chance? So no, it's had a devastating effect, I think. Again, taking a situation that was already bad in terms of staffing,
right,
and exacerbating the situation through a series of moves that frankly were about as inefficient, if you will, as you can imagine. It's not to say that there isn't need for some efficiency and for some streamlining and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you need to understand the operation that you're looking at if you're going to do it, instead of just these wholesale dismissals and funding cuts without having any understanding of how places operate. And again, like I said, most national parks are incredibly efficient operations if you think about the fact that everybody is interdependent when it comes down to the wire. It's not like a municipality where you have hundreds if not thousands of firefighters and hundreds if not thousands of officers. Everybody is interdependent and generally to some measure fills in for other people during emergencies. And if you eliminate that capacity, boy, you've got a bad situation brewing.
Yeah. That and it sounds like it's just going to continue to get worse. If you were in charge of fixing this, how do you start? What's the first step in fixing this?
Well, part of it, of course, is to educate Congress.
Yeah.
And to get advocates in Congress to say, no, we're not doing this. National parks are too important to the country. By the way, they're financial engines for adjacent communities, who rely on the visitation to national parks and the fact that people can safely go to parks. So, there needs to be advocacy there saying, no, we're not going to allow these cuts, and we're going to restore funding to workable levels. So that's number one. then there does need to be, some reorganization of the agency in terms of uh, priorities and oversight, better oversight of field operations, so you have better consistency there. But
Right.
frankly, right now that pales in comparison to just the funding cuts that are devastating.
Yeah, you need money and bodies right now, and then you can kind of work on making sure they're as efficient as possible.
Yeah, yeah, and when you're drowning and just trying to, grab onto a passing log, it's a little difficult to say, well, maybe we should get some lifeguards or something.
Right.
Which, by the way, is another function, right? There are beaches now in national recreation areas that have no lifeguards.
Yeah, and
So
that's kind of scary.
yeah, I mean, it covers, like I said, it covers the entire spectrum of emergency
Well,
service.
and a lot of people, especially with prices rising everywhere, they use the park system as a cheaper vacation. And that's a family vacation, and you want to be safe when you go on a vacation.
Yeah, and another unseen consequence is that if you have fewer law enforcement personnel there are fewer personnel to report crime to. There are fewer personnel to detect and deter crime, and there are fewer personnel to document crime. So,
Right.
you can get kind of an artificial sense that, well, crime has gone down because there's no reports of crime, which is insane if you think about it, but that does happen.
Well, yeah, I'm
And
sure that crime has went down, but it's just because nobody's there to report it to
yeah,
or to
and
detect it.
crime has certainly not gone down.
Right.
That's for sure. And it never will. But you've got to acknowledge the problem. You got to let the public know about it. And again, you're saying what can be done about it. It's got to be advocacy somehow from the very top levels of government, and trying to impress upon people, to educate Congress of the critical role that our law enforcement rangers, that our special agents, and all of the other programs in the parks, the essential role that they play in an interdependent way. That you can't, like I was saying, in an emergency situation, everybody throws in these areas. It's not like a small town, right? Fire department,
Right.
volunteers. That's how a lot of these areas function. And if you think about it, that's an incredibly efficient way to operate
It is.
when you have minimal resources. So,
Yeah.
um, again, I don't want to get into the political realm, but the claim that these cuts are in the name of efficiency is ludicrous.
Well, there's no way it could be because you're
Yeah,
just
I mean,
making it that much. You're taking a staff that's understaffed, overworked, and you're making it worse. I mean, there's no way that could be more efficient.
yeah, and then on top of that, unfortunately, some of the secretarial level managers saying, "Well, you're not allowed to cut services." It's like, well, how the hell are you going to do that? A friend of mine is a superintendent in a park, and he has to spend a good portion of his time out cleaning restrooms.
Yeah.
It's nuts. Which is not
Yeah.
to say that cleaning restrooms is beneath him, but
Well, no, but it just means if he's doing that, he's not doing some of the other vital things that he needs to do. Yeah, that's terrible.
yeah, and that is the reality in a lot of areas right now in the national park system. So yeah,
Well, and I think what you're doing, Paul, just kind of advocating and trying to educate people on what exactly these cuts and these decreases in resources, the effect that it's having, not just on the park system itself, but on everybody. Because everybody treats those as a resource, and we may not have full use of that resource if we don't have people taking care of it.
right. And and again, for sure what you're going to see is, it's more dangerous for the personnel that are there, because the bad guys, the crooks, aren't going to stop coming. In fact, they're going to come and see, wow, this is even easier than it used to be.
Yeah.
I wrote an essay probably 20 or 30 years ago. It's called The Middle of Nowhere Syndrome.
Yeah.
And it's, there's three categories of people. There's the people who go to parks and they leave their cameras on the picnic table. They leave their cars unlocked because they're in the middle of nowhere and there's no crime and we don't have to worry. We can let our guard down here.
Right.
Then there's the people who think, I'm in the middle of nowhere. I can get drunker and act crazier than I do at home because I'm in the middle of nowhere and there's no law enforcement around here. And who cares? I'll just get out of control.
Right.
And then there are actually, believe it or not, professional criminals who target parks, professional burglars who come in.
Oh, I believe that.
Yeah. And they've been, that's been happening for decades. So you have, but they're all relying on the middle of nowhere syndrome. And that's unique. It's not strictly unique, but remote areas, national parks in particular, national forests, those areas experience and witness the middle of nowhere syndrome more than most other areas because of the public perception of no crime, no law enforcement.
Right. Right. And we know there's crime.
Oh, sure. And
it's just nobody to detect it.
It's at a rate comparable to any other tourist town in the country. And another interesting issue, the FBI did a study a long time ago, and they repeated it, that National Park Service rangers are among the most frequently assaulted of any federal law enforcement officer. And that has to do again with the isolation. People who are encounter rangers who say, you can't arrest me, you're not really law enforcement. Right. And they resist more. Lack of access to backup, lack of access to good communication system. And you see all of that. Well,
it would make me hesitate if I was by myself and you're entering an area that has multiple people that you need to police or at least be aware of, and you're by yourself. That's kind of scary. I don't care if you're armed or not.
And on occasion, when I was working in the field, we'd have some urban law enforcement, a cop maybe from LA or somebody would, let's say in Yosemite.
Yeah.
And you're up, way in the back country, and you're going, man, I wouldn't work here. How far are you from backup? Oh, an hour, maybe two. And they're going, are you kidding? It's like, but that's the reality for a lot of these personnel.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of terrifying, really. That's pretty scary. If you're law enforcement in the park system and you're laid off or let go or whatever it is, how easy is it to switch over to like a sheriff's deputy, something like that? Is it compatible, or do you have to go through extra training? How's that work?
Well, you undoubtedly have to go to extra training to learn the state laws and the state policies or the local, stuff. It depends on the jurisdiction. Some rangers who have been laid off, who have been through, obviously been through the federal academy. Some of the states and some of the locals will say, well, that's even better than ours.
Right.
And which in some cases it is. And with some minimal, maybe a week or two of, update on state law and state procedure,
right,
have been recruited. And I think a lot of state agencies have seen, the surplus of this, frustrated former Park Service people and said, yeah, we'll take these guys in a heartbeat. I mean, they're usually EMTs, they're, or medics, full-blown medics.
Yeah, they're usually pretty well trained. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Really well trained. And they've been through federal background investigations already. And so maybe they want to scoop them up. But again, it shifts from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Yeah, and then that I can see where that may cause issues down the road, because at some point, assuming that we reverse course and try to rehire these people, if they've already moved on and found new careers, then you've got to bring in new people and train them. And it doesn't sound like we're going to be set up to actually do that.
Well, and it's more expensive now. So how efficient is that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, early on in this process, I think like in January, February, the Park Service, I think, had, if I'm not sure, one or two full classes scheduled to go to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for the Academy. They canceled those classes because those people were let go. Could be right. They were all probationary. They're new hires.
Well, yeah, they're new hires. Yeah, that's terrible, though.
They're all let go. So even when they say, okay, well, you can hire them back, like I said, you cannot imagine a more inefficient process to dealing with.
Well, I mean, again, I know we don't want to dive into the politics, but just going in and making cuts without fully understanding what it is you're cutting is a terrible way to do business.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's just, I think, apparent on its face. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I know we got to wrap up pretty soon, but I wanted to run through because you have written 3 books, and I wanted to run through those real quick if we could.
Sure.
So the first one you wrote, it's been 30 years or so ago, and that was the U.S. Rangers one, which the title kind of gives it away. But what's that book about?
Well, I started it about 30 or 40 years ago, and I updated it just last year.
Oh, very good.
So it's U.S. Rangers, the Law of the Land, the history of law enforcement in the federal land management agencies. And it talks to some extent about the administrative history of the law enforcement function in the National Park System,
Mhm.
the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and a little bit U.S. Fish and Wildlife, all these agencies that have land management responsibilities.
Yeah.
And I go along with the administrative history. What I've done over the last 40 years is track violent incidents that those rangers have encountered. The earliest ones going back, the earliest one I have documented is actually in 1900.
Oh, okay.
Literally a shootout with the U.S. Forest Service. And then just over the decades, all of these shootouts, assaults on, violent, serious assaults on rangers, murders of rangers, full-blown, very, very serious, violent encounters that these personnel have had. So that book contains 700 examples, and they're just examples. It's not comprehensive of those incidents going all
That's
the
a
way
lot, though.
going from 1900 all the way up to 2023. And I may update it to 2025 because this year alone, there's already been 3 officer-involved fatal shootings.
Oh, really?
Yeah. One in Yellowstone, one in Hawaii, and one at Glen Canyon. The one at Glen Canyon was not fatal, but again, an officer-involved shooting. So they're significant enough, and the numbers seem to be stacking up that I thought it would be worth just updating it a little bit.
Yeah. I love that you're updating it, and that's well, I won't say easy, but that's a book that kind of lends itself to being updated because you're just adding to it.
Well, and that's what I did, for the first 20 years of the thing. Every year I would update it, and then it just became too much of a chore.
Yeah.
But when I retired, people were saying, "Are you ever going to update the book?" And I get reporters saying, "Is there anything that documents all this stuff?" So I figured I'd tackle that. It's 800 pages. It's not a light read.
That'll keep you busy for a while.
Yeah, and it's almost like a reference piece.
Yeah,
So you
and
can
that's
go
kind of
through.
more how I would look at it. It's a reference book.
Yeah, chronologically, you can just go from the earliest of times, 1900s, all the way up to contemporary times. So
Yeah.
that was just re-released last year in its complete form. The other is The Case of the Indian Trader,
Yeah.
subtitled Billy Malone and the National Park Service Investigation at Hubble Trading Post. That chronicles the events surrounding, that investigation at Hubble when I took it over, and what happened before, what happened afterward, and basically kind of just saying, here's where the agency fell down and mismanaged this investigation.
I'm surprised somebody hadn't approached you to turn that into something. That seems like a movie we'd watch or something.
Well, keep saying that. We'll see what happens. And then the other book is Legacy of the Yosemite Mafia, the
Yeah.
Ranger Image and Noble Cause Corruption in the National Park Service. And that actually goes back 30 years to the mid 80s when I was in Yosemite, when I was on the drug squad.
Yeah.
And we got asked, well, in effect, I inadvertently, without my knowledge, got sucked into an illegal bugging incident. The superintendent there had a political adversary, a very high-level political adversary who'd been on National Park Service Advisory Commission. And he was going to have a meeting with the superintendent. The superintendent wanted to have that meeting recorded secretly. So because I was on the drug squad and we had the body wires and all that kind of surveillance equipment, without my knowledge of what it was for, my supervisor had called me and said, "Okay, we're going to wire up the superintendent's office and secretly record this thing in the van." I was under the impression it was going to be a drug buy. So
Right.
fine, okay, that's what I do. And then as I'm listening to this incident, I'm going, this isn't a drug buy. This is politics. And my supervisor, after I made that comment, said, this never happened. Don't ever tell anybody about this. And it was kind of an
Yeah,
oh
it's pretty
shit moment.
suspicious.
Yeah, it was an oh shit moment for me. And basically for the next year and a half, did what I could to report it through channels, eventually up to the office of the inspector general. The superintendent eventually got fired. I was excommunicated and branded disloyal and a traitor and all this kind of stuff. So
I'm always fascinated by that type of whistleblowing, because you're doing the right thing, and this person's doing something that's not legal, and they're going to label you as disloyal because you're turning that person in. That's what we should be doing.
exactly,
It's one thing to be loyal to somebody that's not doing anything wrong, but if they're doing something wrong, that's different.
well, that's this concept of noble cause corruption. It's a police term that goes back to the 80s, where cops would, I know this guy's dirty. I just don't have what I need to pin it on him, so I'll fabricate my report. I'll plant some evidence. This guy's dirty. He's a crook, and
Right.
to get that bust because he's a bad guy anyway, you deviate from procedure and you start breaking the law yourself.
Well, and that's a slippery slope, because
And
once you start doing that and you think it's for noble reasons, at some point it's probably not going to be.
Yeah, and it happens in agencies that tend to have, or agencies or groups of people in agencies who are driven by loyalty and an excessive sense of idealism.
Right.
Right. And people who come to the Park Service, they love the agency, they love its mission, they're hardworking. And a point I want to reiterate is that 99% of Park Service employees are the most honest, hardworking people you can imagine. Who
Yeah.
put out 150% every day in their jobs. But those people also, because they're indoctrinated that the Park Service is a wonderful organization. Well, don't report this because it'll be an embarrassment to the agency, right? And they go, yeah,
Right.
I don't want to embarrass the agency. It is a slippery slope, but you can see where people who are driven by an overzealous sense of idealism can fall into that trap.
Yeah,
And
100%.
yeah, and it's not just the Park Service, of course, but a lot of agencies, a lot of segments, of, let's say, sheriff's departments or big organizations. This group, this band of rogue cops, these guys are all scum, and so you know fabricate probable cause,
Right.
or whatever, because these are all bad guys. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. These very simplistic characterizations of people that don't recognize the real responsibility to be professional, to do law enforcement, to enforce the law, which means sometimes you don't get what you want, but
That's right.
that's the job.
Yeah, but you got to follow the law. That's what they're there for, even if it means that somebody that's doing something illegal gets away with it, at least temporarily.
Yeah, and that's the nature of the job.
Yeah.
But that's something that needs to be reinforced, and I know a lot of agencies try to reinforce that. So, but again, it's not just law enforcement personnel that can fall into that trap. It's
Sure.
it's the interpreter, it's the accountant in an office that sees something funny going on. Maybe the superintendent or some other manager is misusing the credit card. Well, he's such a good guy, and if we do that, God, it'll embarrass the agency and it'll ruin his career or her career. Yeah, and there needs to be, I think, a more rigorous and a more supportive atmosphere for reporting misconduct.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, and it needs to be set up so that it's not a negative to the person reporting.
Yeah. So that there are not disincentives
Right.
to standing up and reporting that kind of thing. And those disincentives, I think, do exist in the Park Service, but the Park Service is not the only agency that has that problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, Paul, thank you for taking a little bit of time and kind of walking us through that. It's a little disheartening to listen to, but if we're not aware of the problem, we can't fix the problem. So I think we're doing good work, just getting the word out there about the the issues that are being caused by the way we're running our park services.
Yep. And again, it's just the public and Congress needs to be more aware of the critical function that all Park Service employees play. In my views, most significantly, the law enforcement and emergency services personnel, but across the board, like I said, it's an interdependent operation in almost every park. You can't function without the support from those other branches.
Any plans to write any further books?
Maybe one, which is, it's kind of an unusual incident. Back in 1973, there was a ranger murdered at Point Reyes National Seashore.
Yeah.
Guy's name was Ken Patrick. And the Park Service at the time, because again, they didn't acknowledge the history of the agency, claimed that he was the first ranger murdered in the agency. Well, he was not. He was the third.
Right.
But nevertheless, it made a big splash because by 1973, there was television. It was Point Reyes near San Francisco.
Right.
So it was a high profile incident. The FBI agent who worked and solved the case wrote a manuscript. And I was working with him 15, 20 years ago to kind of polish it up and try to get it into published. He had no luck getting a publisher.
Yeah.
Well, he's died since then. And I still have the manuscript that I want to work on. So if I can get authorization and locate his family, I want to polish it up, get it out there, and that would probably be my last book.
Yeah, and what a great legacy for your friend there. I mean, just to finish his work that he was trying to do. I know if that was my family, I'd be all for that.
Yeah, and they may well be. I just can't find them.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, Paul, thank you so much. I hope we get to talk again at some point. Are you on social media? Do you have a website? If people want to know more, where can they go?
I've got a website, thelawoftheland.net.
Yeah.
The law of the land, all one word, .net. And I have, there's more information about those 3 books. There's a bunch of essays and magazine articles. I used to write for SWAT magazine and some of the police magazines. So most of my articles are there, podcasts, and maybe with your permission, I'll put a link to yours in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a really good website. You can tell you've put a little bit of time in on it.
Well, I have a great IT person. I didn't put much time.
You got to have a guy.
Well, it's a lady, and man, she's wonderful.
A person. You got to have a person.
Well, boy, is she ever patient with me, because as you know, I had a hard time even hooking up with you on this thing. So.
No, I think that's terrific, because a lot of people think that creating a website's the hard part. That's actually the easy part. It's maintaining it that takes some time.
Keeping it updated, but yeah, no, I think it's a good website, and they'll find a lot of information. And there's also a way to contact me through there if they want to.
Terrific. Well, Paul, thank you so much, and please come back anytime.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it, and thanks for helping to get the word out about the problem.
No, it's such a vital function. I think that, I was born and raised in West Virginia. We take our parks pretty serious here, and it's anything that would diminish those. And we're already seeing it. You go to a park now, and a lot of times you never see a worker anymore, where in the past, if you went, you would normally run into somebody.
And it's only going to get worse if we can't, correct the course, get the funding back, and address all of these other issues. Yeah, no, the national park system is a wonderful, truly American, patriotic, idea and organization, and it needs the support of the country.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, all right, hold on one second, Paul. Hope you enjoyed that. Paul Berkowitz, retired National Park Service Special Agent. That's a mouthful, but kind of fun to say. I think Paul really did a great job just lining out the issues that the Park Service is currently having with understaffing, underfunding, and a misunderstanding from the public about what it is exactly that the National Park System does. So I think Paul's doing great work getting that word out. His books are terrific, so I hope you take a minute and look those up. U.S. Rangers, Law of the Land, Case of the Indian Trader, and Legacy of the Yosemite Mafia. Just terrific books on the national park system and the national park people that man that system. So definitely check those books out. If you're looking for a show or a movie that kind of shows some of what the park system does, and I have no way of knowing how accurate it is or anything like that, but Joe Pickett on Paramount or CBS, it's the show it's not there it's not being made anymore. There's 2 seasons. They're both really well done. We've had a few of that cast has been on the podcast, so there's that. But in my mind, it was a really good representation of the national park system and some of the rangers that work there, and also gave you a little bit of look at some of the possible criminal activities that can occur within that park system. So Joe Pickett on Paramount, if you're just looking for a good show to watch. Couple seasons, in my opinion, it should have kept going, but they ended it after two seasons, and it does give you a kind of an ending. So it's not a wasted effort. But again, no idea how accurate it actually is, but it seems like they had it pretty nailed in my opinion. If you're finding us for the first time, so happy that you're here. Love to have your support. It's easy to do. It's free. We do not ask for any money. Our website's meistercon.com. You can find next week, we're going to put up episode 1000, if you can believe that. And all of those audio and video versions are on our website, meistercon.com. So please check us out there. Our YouTube channel is MeisterCon Pod. Please subscribe. That's how you can help us out. Please subscribe. It's free, but those subscriptions really help us to continue to bring these terrific guests on the show. MeisterCon Pod on YouTube. Thank you guys so much. Till next time. Bye, everybody.